The next topic that we were looking at in lecture number 7 was then secondary succession. And secondary succession will be then about some kind of disturbance of an already existing ecosystem where we have, in our cases, like forests that would be disturbed by forces of like fires, or here we can also think about human disturbances, so deforestation, cutting out trees, but also storms, partly volcanic activity, or floods could be causing some kind of disturbance to such an already existing ecosystem. There are two things that we're speaking about, so two terms which we should know about, and the most important here would be serotiny. Serotiny, or speaking about serotinous plants, we're thinking about those that like have pine cones. Just to look at one example, we have these seeds within the pines. These forests would open thanks to heat. So whenever we have like a forest fire that would cause some kind of extreme heat, it would be that moment when the cone would release some of its seeds, so these would pop out, fly out, thanks to the heat. So actually, forest fire would be something that would help regeneration of the whole ecosystem itself. It would be useful in a way as well. And also we were speaking about resprouters or resprouting. And when we speak about resprouting or resprouters, it would mean that we have some of these plants that would be able to, whenever they are disturbed from their roots, regrow once again, so they can be burnt off from time to time and they would be able to regrow, or some of these plants would be growing from like under surface sprouts, so spreading in such a way that little branches or leaves would be coming up to the surface after they moved or grew underground. So this is a way that some bits of the plant can be protected in a way whenever there is a forest fire or any kind of fire on the surface, that these parts of the plant would be protected and would be able to be the source of new plants again. This is just thinking about possible differences between the types of processes that take part in secondary succession. Now, as you've seen earlier in one of the exams that I showed you, we had a kind of question which is about how does the environment change, and that is going to be interesting here. So how can we think of the whole like ecosystem change, so not only the soil but the conditions of an ecosystem, And there were three different factors or kinds of effects that we have a look at: chemical, there will also be some of the physical, and finally the biological effects. There you go, biological. And here then we would have altogether such factors. And first we can speak about the chemical differences. Mineral changes. So there will be a kind of mineral release from ash. Mineral release from the ash or ashes of plants and weathering. So that's one point that we should think about. Also including here the phosphate content. Which will later on be supporting the regeneration of the ecosystem. And also here we can think about calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So these elements that would have a higher concentration in the soil than before. And also we can think here about the nutrient cycle, which would be faster. So the nutrient cycle. Down there. So nutrient cycle would be the fourth point here, that we can think of how the actual conditions in the chemical composition or chemical processes related part of the ecosystem would be changing. Now there would also be more physical processes or physical effects, and partly there would be the vegetation cover that would disappear. So there would be much more sunshine, and we can just put here a limitation of cover or vegetation cover. So a limitation of the vegetation cover, there would be less of shade, more shade intolerant species would be able to develop, such as we said, fireweed and such. Also there would be a reduction of humus layer, so this would mean that there's a less of insulation. Reduction of humus, so the top layer of the soil, which partly will be burnt as it would be origin and carbon itself. And we can think here about a change in color. So the surface itself would become somewhat darker. So that would be increasing the heat absorption. So the surface would become warmer faster than before. So we can think here blackened surfaces. and the related process of like increasing heat absorption. There's also related to this one, the soil temperature would be changing, so higher or increased soil temperature. And finally, a fifth point here, we can think about the changing permafrost depths. What does it mean that the soil, in certain cases, if here we can think of like the boreal forest, of the higher latitudes, so in this case we can think of the area often being permanently frozen, and in this case, if we have higher soil temperature, blackened surface, perhaps these soil layers that would be frozen throughout the year, those would disappear, so there would be less frost in the soil, perhaps enabling more development of the vegetation itself. And then we can think about the biological effects, which would be including things like the pathogens, so these would be controlled. Like the pathogens would mean here that we have like bacteria, fungi, whatever, those kinds of diseases that would attack or spread diseases in general in the forest, attack the trees themselves. So whenever there's this kind of outbreak of a disease in a forest, the fire itself would be controlling the spread of this. And so in a way, in a larger scale, maybe a continental scale, here we can say that forest fires could protect parts of like the whole population from being killed or damaged by pathogens. If the fire only would eat up and destroy parts of the population. Now we can also think here about increased root penetration. What does it mean that whenever there's a forest fire, kind of a result of this would be that the plants would, with their, so this is the plant, the surface over here, would dig down, reach down deeper with their roots, partly because of these changes in permafrost depths or the soil temperature or itself, or the perhaps reduction of the humus layer. So later on this could increase the strength of trees and so on. So in a way this could support the plants, the vegetation itself. And the final point in our little table here, we can think about productivity that would be growing. So there's a greater productivity and higher biodiversity overall. So the forest fire would actually renew the whole ecosystem and support the opportunity at all for the immigration of new species. Perhaps some would be extinct, but there will be a chance for new species to arrive or to at all be present in the area for at least some period of time until climax species such as like the fir or the spruce would create the kind of shade with their canopy. So for a certain time, again, there would be higher biodiversity, greater productivity in the ecosystem. So these are just some points that we should remember about how secondary succession would mean a change in the ecosystem with different effects in chemical, physical, and biological properties of this area. Beyond all this, we also need to once again memorize what kind of species would be present in an area such as like a boreal forest in different stages of the secondary succession. And here we were speaking about four main like types or four main species, types of plants that would be present. We said that there would be fireweed and birch. The fireweed is a small plant, like a flower. We said it's a purple flower. The birch is a tree which has the white trunk. So it's going to be something that is relatively a soft wood. It's not really a strong piece of wood. It would grow very quickly. So if you buy a house, you want to have a garden, you want to have trees in your garden, one of the things that you can do is plant birch trees, because in your life cycle, in your lifetime, by the time that you have children, you will already have a full-grown tree over there. It's so quick growing. These are what we could say to some extent the are selected or kind of the pioneers. And so climax species would be the spruce and especially the fir So these are what we could consider to some extent case selected, or at least the fir would be case selected, if not the spruce. These are somewhere in between in this kind of cycle, in this kind of stepwise process. So in this case, what we would have again is different period by which different species would be present or dominant in such an area. First, we said that the fireweed would be present, so already like after 1 year following the forest fire, so that would be then the time, the horizontal axis, and here perhaps we can think about the population size as the vertical axis. So it's first the fireweed that would be present, and this would be then decreasing in its number very quickly and perhaps almost disappearing. So then the next stage would be the appearance of the birch tree, which we said would be mature in a kind of like 20 years time cycle, and perhaps it would be decreasing in a lower rate, lower speed, and perhaps here again we can put this is 20 years time, so that's a 20, and the birch, when it starts decreasing, that would be the time when already like the spruce would be coming to its kind of peak, and this would be something that would actually be present in the forest. It would not decrease really, just only to some extent, and it would have its kind of peak here at the age of like 50 years after the fire had happened, and it's like after say 80 or such years that the fir would be present. We might say that these start growing at the same time, but since the fir would be growing so slowly, we might say that it would take 60, 70, 80 years following the forest fire that they would become dominant. So first fireweed, then we would have the birch, spruce, and fir. So one of the possible questions is the exam would concern how these behave, how these are following each other in different stages of secondary succession, what type of plants these are, whether they are or case selected, pioneer, or climax species, how they would perhaps also spread their seeds, so to what extent they would be like serotinous, or for example fireweed would be spreading its seeds thanks to the wind. These kinds of things we can think of when we want to describe these types of species, or maybe not even species but groups of species. Think about these conifers over there. So this is just a very brief recap of secondary succession then.